less to introduce a person or persons who have done something that really makes you feel good. And I think that's proof that these two liberal gentlemen I'm living proof that they've had a revolutionary effect on me, because as a child I always longed to be Tom Mix. He was the only one I knew of until finally Hoot Gibson came along and the others that I named. But now if I'm allowed to grow up, I certainly want to be Jesse Stahl and Pickett. So it was all a little too brief, but I think if there's anything or any aspect of what we've heard and seen this evening that we'd like to have a little light thrown upon, they will be most pleased to oblige. So if you have any questions about any aspect of it, please just raise them. The floor is now open. Sir? Where did they find the majority of the material?
In the UCLA library. There's plenty of material. It just had never been gathered. I mean, if one were to, or if two, I should say, were to do this properly, take 10 years, go to all the cow towns of the West, go into the county courthouses, the city places, the museums, and all of this, he could write 7 volumes, but we didn't have to. It's simply that nobody bothered to collect it. It's all there.
Did I see a hand over there? Sir?
Really on Wide World of Sports a number of years ago, there was a Negro Bulldog from Texas named Pickett. I'm sure I saw this. Is he in relation to Pickett, or is he just taking a name?
Probably the same. Oh, you mean? Oh, recently?
Oh, 5 years ago, Wide World of Sports.
We really can't answer that question. We know that Pickett had a brother who was a competitor in some rodeos. Both Pickett, of course, is dead and would have been dead at the time you speak of. His brother probably would now be a very, very old man or dead, but whether we don't know much about Bill's family life, and we know nothing about his brother's family life. You may have seen the son of Pickett. It looks like the son of Tarzan. On the other hand, it became a famous name, and it may have been taken as a show name. Your guess is as good as ours at the moment.
Incidentally, we noticed in the last 2 or 3 years that all around, not all around, but in many towns of the West, in the rodeos, you will see on the program now a reference to Bill Pickett. We saw this 2 or 3 times just last year. That he has been discovered, and they are using him to advertise rodeos in the West.
Are there any more? Miss?
Are there now cowboys in California, Negro and white? Are there working cowboys in California?
Yes and no. Let's start with the no. As I say, the King Ranch, for instance, refuses to use the word cowboy, as they insist that in the modern ranch, with a modern steer, that a cowboy belongs on a screen, that a real cowboy, as we think of him, would frighten too much beef off the steer. The modern steer, first of all, has been the product of scientific breeding over a long enough period now, so that he's almost an indecent thing to look at. He's a large, heavy, top-heavy, slow-moving animal. And any relationship between the modern beef steer and the old longhorn is purely coincidental. Because he is a large, slow-moving animal, he's no longer driven to market. He's treated as what he is, a valuable amount of meat on the hoof. He's walked around very slowly so that he won't sweat. And he's carried very carefully to market in trucks and virtually padded cattle cars. So that in one sense, you can say that the cowboy today exists, in the sense that we think of cowboy, in the rodeo, on the screen, in the Western show, but except in a very few places, peculiarly enough, like some of the rougher country in Florida, like much of the rougher country in Canada, where there still is some old-fashioned free-range herding of cows, a cowboy now is more generally known as a ranch hand, and he spends much of his time tending windmills and pitching manure and baling hay and doing a lot of things that the old-time cowboy would have been scorned to do or to be seen doing. This is the no, in the sense that, no, there probably are no cowboys in the old sense. Yes, there are Negro cowboys, certainly. A number in Florida, a number working on ranches, usually near the Gulf in Texas, though throughout Texas, as far north as Weatherford and Big Spring. There are some Negro cowboys, but comparatively few, working in Wyoming and in Montana, because what we found, generally speaking, was that while thousands of cowboys did ride to Wyoming and Montana, they generally rode back. And when they married Texas women, and they settled and stayed in Texas. And there are today in rodeo competition a number of Negro cowboys. For a while in the 20s and early 30s, so far as we can see, the Rodeo Cowboys Association was Jim Crowed, but that certainly stopped in the 30s. There are now Negro competitors in the Rodeo Cowboys Association, some of whom have won big money, and I think they've been most conspicuous and most successful, and this perhaps is a tribute to Bill Pickett, in bulldogging.
Young lady in red.
Two-part question. Were the Negro Cowboys, their activities recorded in newspapers of the day? And if so, when did they stop reporting their activities and then why?
Well, they were recorded in the day insofar as they recorded the activities of any cowboy. And one of the things, of course, that we were aware of as we were doing this is that we undoubtedly missed noting thousands of Negro cowboys because so often they wouldn't be designated as such unless they had done something either good or bad. As I said, we didn't spend as much time in the newspapers as we could have or perhaps should have. But in the little newspapers in Texas, in Kansas, and other places, they've always told about the events, especially if they did something a little outstanding or a little outlandish. They love to write up accounts of somebody shooting up something. And there are lots of accounts of Negro cowboys shooting up things, shooting up each other. But any Western cow town just loved to write up some story about some cowboy shooting another cowboy or shooting out the lights in the saloon or whatever it was. But I don't know that they were written up as cowboys per se in any other particular sense.
Sir?
I was just wondering, maybe you said it before, how did Negroes in particular get into cow hunting?
They got into it because they were drafted. They came to Texas as slaves. And there were millions of slaves in Texas at the beginning of the Civil War. Most of the slaves in eastern Texas were engaged in hoeing cotton, working plantations, growing pecans. But in central Texas and in south central Texas, there were Negro cowboy slaves. In fact, in the book we have a chapter called Slaves on Horseback. And here they were taught either by Mexican vaqueros or by white masters or by Indians from the Caddo Confederacy the essential working tricks of working cattle. There was one difference, rather ironically, between the Negro slave cowboy and the free Negro cowboy. The Negro slave cowboy was valuable. So you get the story told by Shanghai Pierce of working before the Civil War on a ranch. He was the only white cowboy hired on the ranch. And one day when the boss and Shanghai Pierce and an all-Negro crew of cowboys were out in the corral breaking wild horses, they put one of the Negro cowboys on the horse, and the horse went off humping and pitching into the corral, and the wife of the boss yells from the house, Abel, get that Negro off the horse and put Shanghai on it. Those Negroes are worth $1,000 apiece. There was a very real fear, of course, if a Negro was your property and his value was from $800 to $1,200, that you were risking big money if you put him to breaking wild horses. So it was a commonplace in pre-Civil War days throughout Texas for white ranch owners who owned large numbers of Negro cowboys, who did ride herd on cattle, to hire white horsebreakers on the theory that you could hire a horsebreaker for $15 a month, and if he broke his neck, all you had to do was bury him. This kind of distinction reached its logical conclusion, not in terms of cowboys, but in the letter written during the Civil War by a southern plantation owner to his son. And I still can't believe this letter, but it's a genuine letter. He wrote to his son, I hear you're going into battle. If you do, don't take Sam in with you, because that Negro is worth $1,000.
Well, it has already, I think.
We're having a real argument about how immodest we should be. I think, first of all, the myth is constantly changing. One of the things that fascinates us about the Western story or the Western myth is that it's a bottle into which you can pour many kinds of wine. And if you've watched your television set too much and have seen too many Westerns, you've noticed that it's possible for the old program Maverick to play The Rivals as a Western. It's possible to, and these days all too possible, to have bonanza after bonanza after bonanza, which reads like a Freudian casebook. The Western myth and legend has, as one of its attractions, the fact that it will soak up anything and everything almost as a sponge. But we have been, in fact, we expected far more resistance to the book and less reaction in some ways to the book than we got. We don't pretend for a moment there hadn't been a trend toward opening up casting even in Westerns before the book was published. But since that time, we've been given explicit credit by a number of producers, and we've noticed with some pleasure that so far as the films and the television programs, which in our modern society are the most potent influences on the myth, so far as these media are concerned, there's a tendency to recognize in fiction what we now know was certainly true in fact. So that our hope is that we have helped modify the myth, and certainly since we're going to go on studying it in other books, maybe we can give it a few more nudges.
Yes.
In your book, you mentioned that Eastern Montana was particularly hostile to the Negro and the Negro Cowboy. And I was wondering if you said you've done more research and then come up with any more information on the Negro Cowboy in Montana.
Not so much eastern Montana as it seemed to us from the evidence we had, and I don't pretend that it's conclusive, that near the headwaters of the Missouri, which had been settled in large part initially by a number of Southerners, and also what permanent Negro population there was, had come up on the steamboats and had either left ship or jumped ship there, so that you had essentially a group of transplanted Southerners with a number of tensions that have been brought up from the South. You had an abnormal situation so far as the West as a whole was concerned. And this we said. The other thing is that whenever peculiarly throughout the West, it seemed to us that the stories of our Negro Cowboys in Montana always ended in an unnecessary shooting or in an unnecessary bloodletting, and we found a few, but comparatively few by comparison with the other states, who had settled there and made for themselves a successful life. Since that time, I've been waiting, and this question, I think, indicates what we've been waiting for. I've been waiting for real Montana people to write down saying, you libeled our state, you said things that aren't true, we're really good people too. But so far we've had no complaints like that. But from the admittedly inadequate evidence, and as Phil has said, we didn't do what real scholars would have done and spent the 10 years going from town to town and archive to archive, though we read more county histories than anyone should have to read. In our limited experience, we found that Montana did seem to be peculiarly inhospitable or unfriendly seemingly to the Negro Cowboy.
I think by contrast, too, we found that Wyoming was particularly gracious and liberal, and it must have been, in part at least, brought about by the people who settled there. Again, Oregon generally was antagonistic because the Willamette Valley was settled by a bunch of Missourians. So whichever group settled it, and you could almost go around state by state and find a checkerboard kind of thing. Some very generous and some very antagonistic. I suppose in part too it was due to the economics of the situation.
Gentleman in blue.
Law that we talked about cowboys, sort of the old story, the very Negro law.
Yes. There were, well, this was particularly true in some of the years after the Civil War during Reconstruction. There were deputies, sheriffs, in fact, federal marshals, which was very antagonistic to the Texans, obviously, to be arrested during those 10 years after the Civil War by a Negro lawman. But there were quite a few, from all accounts, having done a first-rate job. But again, that's another story and perhaps another book.
Sir?
There are a number of, what should we say, reasonably bawdy jokes about the sons of the Golden West, for that matter. The insistence being that the sons of the Golden West very rarely boast about their mothers. It's quite true that the West was primarily, as any frontier is, was primarily a man's environment. And women came out certainly as cooks and as restaurant workers, but a large number came out to occupy whorehouses. The frontier in its initial stages is not a woman's environment, except in these rather specialized occupations. And what you did get very quickly as what we call the sod-busting frontier moved west, and this is almost a stereotype, a staple of the Western fiction and Western movie. As the farmers came, they came, of course, with their families and their children and their milk cows, and the women came with their whole code of morals and with their preachers and with their desire to start a sound local government, and usually this resulted in the closing up of the red light district and of many of the saloons, and the frontier moved farther west. But certainly the stereotype picture of a cow town primarily full of men with only a very few women, and probably in reality not so glamorous as Kitty in Gunsmoke, is a historically sound picture.
Sir, third row.
This really is I suppose, the source of the background of this study. The first well-known, outstanding, successful Western story was Owen Wister's The Virginian in 1902. There had been a few attempts at writing a Western before that time, but this was the one that caught everybody's fancy. It became the stereotype. 1902, you couldn't find a better year for the nadir of Negro-white relationships. This was the period in which we were all out for Anglo-Saxon supremacy. The white was going to save the world and all this kind of business. So the first real successful Western story, written at the height of this kind of social situation, a romantic account, and as Wister said, it's already an historical account. He couldn't, even if he had been something other than a Philadelphia lawyer and a Harvard overseer, couldn't have put a Negro in it. It was just, at that time and place and so on, Wister being what he was, the times what they were, it just wouldn't have gone. So there are no Negroes in it. It set the form, it was the stereotype for all succeeding Western stories. Almost everything that's ever been done since is still just redoing the Virginian. And you could count on one hand, or at least at most two hands, the number of Westerns out of the thousands and thousands that have ever put a Negro in them. So since that time, 65 years, people know about themselves, about their country, about whatever it is through fiction. Most people read only fiction, the novel. They don't go to scientific accounts or histories. They read fiction, and whatever they read in fiction becomes real to them. So it would never occur to anybody to think that there was a Negro cowboy. Why should they? He didn't appear in fiction. And who's going to write a story with a Negro cowboy in it if he couldn't sell the book? And now there is some chance of this changing because it has been proved that there are Negro cowboys, but even now I suspect it will come rather slowly because, you see, people live on myth. Myth is much truer than truth. And you're not going to change truth, which in this case is myth. And if you put reality on the television screen and it's different from myth, you're going to close it down in 3 weeks because nobody will buy it.
Well, that's about where it's at, unless there are some urgent questions about Stagecoach Mary or some other equally colorful figure. At least that's about, it's almost where it's at because our two authors are still in the process of their research and they're going to write more about this subject. Just a moment to elaborate on why I'm made to feel good, as I'm sure many or most of you are made to feel good by this body of knowledge. Because well, I'm glad to know that there was a Stagecoach Mary, there was a Bill Pickett. I'm not offended to know that there was a Cherokee Bill who was more infamous in ways than Billy the Kid. I'm glad to know that I am of the stock of people who participated in all of the endeavors of man and the building of these great United States. And I think that's very important because I was made to believe as a child that we were dragged here with rings in our noses from some remote area of Africa, and that there was no past prior to that. And it's good to know about our past because that's sort of our backbone, and that gives us a present, and that will, I'm sure, help foretell what the future is going to be like. So I think we all owe a great debt of gratitude to Messrs. Durham and Jones.